Good afternoon, everybody. It is Friday, November 7th, 2020. I'm Keir Murray, and I'm joined by my dad, Dr. Richard Murray from the University of Houston. Hi, Dad. How are you today?
I'm just fine. Just fine.
So slow news week, as usual. Just kidding. Obviously, we are now in the aftermath of the November 3rd presidential election. As we speak, results are not final, but it looks pretty clear based on vote counts that are coming in Pennsylvania, Georgia, Nevada, and Arizona, that Joe Biden has very likely been elected the next president of the United States. What are your top of head thoughts about what happened nationally on Tuesday?
I thought it was a very disappointing coverage of the election and the counting that didn't sufficiently emphasize that this year we have these two big pools of votes. One, the biggest pool, over 100 million, are the people that either voted in person election day, and those are counted pretty quickly most places, or they were like Texas and Florida that can take mail ballots but start processing them. So those votes get reported very quickly on the evening of the election. But you had a huge second pool of about 50 million votes that were from in states like Pennsylvania, which did not allow mail ballots to be open. The first group is substantially for Trump because they didn't do many mail votes, but the second ones are overwhelmingly for Biden. And that wasn't emphasized enough. So this sort of early night, situation where it looks like, gee, Trump's duplicating his win in 2016. It's a very different kind of count this time around. And now that we are beginning to get a more complete picture of the electorate, it was far more favorable to Biden than people realized until, in some instances, yesterday, when they began to see how the early vote was actually the mail votes were going to substantially change the result, even in Georgia, where nobody thought the 350,000 vote Trump lead would turn into minus 15 votes today or something like that, 1,015.
Yeah, and I guess that said, I think overall, based on national and most state polling going into Tuesday, that most we had again it's somewhat of a miss here because the race was closer both nationally so far and in the many of these battleground states than polling showed it would be. What's your sense of that?
Yeah, the consensus of the quality polls was that Biden ought to win by 8 to 9%. It looks like it's going to be right at half of that. When all the votes are counted, he'll win by about 4.5%. Still substantial, much more than Hillary Clinton's lead, and big enough to win in the Electoral College, which of course is ultimately what really matters. But that's outside the normal margin of error, particularly for an average of the quality polls. So it looks like, again, there was something systematically happening with the way the pollsters were setting up their framework to cover this election, that they understated again the vote for Trump. And you would think that's, it's just, they must have had a model of turnout that underestimated the vote that Trump could turn out. Trump did invest, back when Brad Parscale was running the operation, a huge amount of money in building up an infrastructure, the so-called Death Star, that they felt would cinch the election for Trump because they would putting in an enormous investment into building up databases, field operations. And that's difficult for pollsters to figure out what difference something like that would make. Meantime, Biden, of course, had no money early in the year. And by the time he started getting cash, well, the virus was there and the Biden campaign didn't invest that much in any kind of counter field effort. So it looks like to me that the Trump campaign worked pretty damn well. He got more than 10 million additional votes in this election than he got 4 years ago. Normally, that would lock up the election, but it's something we'll touch on. Biden's going to end up with 15 million more votes than Hillary Clinton, easily breaching 80 million. She got about 66 million. So in a certain sense, both of these campaigns really outperformed in terms of voter turnout, probably because voters really wanted to vote this year, and both of them succeeded in getting their vote out.
I mean, how much of that do you think is down to the operations of the individual campaigns rather than simply just a referendum on Donald Trump himself, who is a ubiquitous, ever present media figure, an extremely polarizing figure. People tend to have very strong feelings about him, yay or nay. How much of this had to do with the campaigns and more just about him?
I think about him first. Trump, as I've been saying for years, is the ultimate turnout machine. That he makes people on both sides really motivated to go vote. Then you put in place probably the best funded campaign on each side ever. Over $1 billion on for Trump and something north of that probably for Biden. So you have additional resources and an electorate that wants to vote. And the one thing we found out once we started early voting is fear of the virus is not going to depress turnout.
Yeah, and I've been thinking about this a lot as it relates to Texas and I think some other parts of the country. And, the Biden campaign and Democrats generally, I think, latched on to the COVID-19 issue as a big plank in their campaign against the president, his mismanagement of the crisis or lack of ability to take or willingness to take it seriously, et cetera. I think that probably was a successful campaign for Democrats with women. But I wonder if some of the erosion that we saw with Democrats among working class men, especially working class men of color, may have been a backlash to some of that, some of those efforts, meaning, the quote unquote mommy state trying to tell me what to do, wear a mask, social distance, et cetera, a rejection of that sort of idea. But also, perhaps more importantly, this notion that the restrictions being advocated or even put in place to combat COVID, which make total sense from a public health standpoint, from an economic standpoint, are making it difficult for some of these folks to make a living. I wonder if that issue didn't cut as universally in Democrats' favor as they maybe thought it might. That's just a hunch on my part, but if I had to guess, there was some of that going on with Black and Latino men, for example.
Well, if you look at the underperforming on the Democratic coalition side, which is we know is very broad, very diverse, clearly in a lot of states, Texas and Florida, to take examples, the Democratic vote with Latinos was very disappointing. Now in Florida, you have the special circumstances of lots of Cuban Americans and Venezuelans who've come in that looked like they were the argument that the Democrats are socialist, it cut there, but that argument, we don't have very many Cuban or Venezuelan voters in Texas, and we have Starr County, perhaps the most heavily Hispanic county in the state, with Trump's margin of there being only down by 6 or 7 points. That's an astounding figure. Clinton won the county by about 60. So, yeah, something happened in these communities, a little bit in the Black community, but Black women, it seems, were not affected. Their votes were overwhelmingly Democratic. Black men a bit, younger Black men, but still, it looks to me like overall the damage to the Democrats was much greater in Hispanic, excepting in the far West. Arizona, it looks like Latino vote was fine for Democrats and probably helped them eventually win that state.
Yeah, I know just anecdotally in Texas from folks around the state that I interacted with prior to during the campaigns, and that I suspect that the defund the police message from the Republicans, coupled with some lack of comfort with the Black Lives Matter movement among some members of the Latino community, hurt Democrats with some of those voters. Again, it would, a state like Arizona, I think doesn't have very many Black residents, whereas Florida and Texas do. I don't know if there's some exploiting a racial tension there that was effective for Republicans. I mean, I don't have any evidence to support that, but
Yeah.
just some of the things I heard from people on campaigns in the Valley and even here in the Houston area among the Hispanic community was just sort of visceral reaction about Democrats wanting to defund the police and that they don't like the Black Lives Matter movement. Nothing scientific there, but I'm guessing these little factors all played a part, if I had to guess.
Yeah. Now, nationally, the Democrats outperformed in many constituencies, but one thing I'd like to emphasize is, Joe Biden obviously made a plank of his argument to getting the nomination and then to try to win the election. I can restore the blue wall. I can connect with even white working class men that pretty massively defected to Trump in 2016. And of course, he apparently has restored the blue wall. Pennsylvania is almost certainly now going to be a state that goes for Joe Biden because all the votes that are out are about 80% for him. But when you look at how he restored it, Wisconsin's a pretty good example. Clinton lost it by 20,000. He won it by 20,000. But he only flipped a couple of real small counties. He didn't do any really better with white working class people. He won Wisconsin because he drove up turnout in the big cities. And Madison, the fastest growing metropolitan area in the state, overwhelmingly. So that's improving with suburban women, younger voters, and just running up margins that even though the rest of the state's voting pretty heavily for Trump, they couldn't keep up. Another example in Detroit, the kind of classic Reagan Democrat blue collar worker who used to be union guy would voted Democrat but switched to the Republicans. That's in Macomb County. That's county northeast of city of Detroit and Wayne County. Trump carried it in 2016. He carried it again in 2020. The reason he lost the election, Trump, was in the adjacent Oakland County. That's a very big suburban, more affluent county. Used to be very Republican. It went strongly Democratic. So that's, again, the suburban women that we've been seeing Trump having trouble with ever since, I think, the Access Hollywood tape 4 years ago. They didn't come back. They, despite his entreaties, you got to support me. Looks like they voted pretty overwhelmingly and voted against him. And that killed him in Michigan because Wayne County, I think Kamala Harris helped there get the black vote out up to a reasonable level. But the suburban vote in the more affluent and educated areas was very strongly anti-Trump.
Yeah. And just trying to think about some of the down ballot effects. Obviously, going into the election, Democrats felt bullish about their prospects to take control of the U.S. Senate and to gain seats in the U.S. House. At least as of now, it appears neither of those things happen. And, what we saw is down ballot Republicans overperforming Trump in these states and at the district level, generally speaking. There are some exceptions to that. What do you make of how that played out versus what expectations were?
Well, what's been happening lately is that you get very few split results, even though the Republicans had 23, I believe, seats up to the Democrats' 12. 21 of those Senate seats up, and mostly with incumbents running for re-election, were in states that Trump won. And in this election, you only had 2 deviations from the 2016 presidential race. Clinton carried Maine narrowly, and Susan Collins held on there. Republican bucks the trend, and Biden won it again. And in Arizona, a state that Trump won, the Republican senator was defeated. But notice that today, Trump's likely going to lose Arizona. So basically, the Senate races went the same way as the presidential race. Now, there's a warning there. The Republicans have a big Senate class up in 2022, and many of those are in states that Biden is winning. So Mitch can't rest easy with his majority, which may not be a majority, but probably will be, because they have a huge exposure in states that went Democratic this week.
Right. And what about on the U.S. House level? I mean, again, a lot of the losses that Democrats suffered that were unexpected were in some of these suburban districts, like, for example, Kendra Horn in Oklahoma City, who narrowly won in 2018. The suburbs had been such a fertile ground for Democrats in 2018 for gaining seats, didn't turn out that way. At least so as far as we know now in 2020. What do you think explains that?
Well, remember, the great majority of those seats that the Democrats won, about 40 seats, were in districts that Trump had carried in 2016, like the Oklahoma City district. So in a sense, they sort of reverted to the mean. They went back to their more traditional Republican. Democrats held enough of them to hold on to their margin, but those were seats that generally were presidentially Republican, but the Democrats, were able to turn them in 218, but the turnout was much, much higher in 220, so that you had to get a lot more votes. The Democrats were pretty clearly motivated in 2018 at a far higher level than Republicans because Trump wasn't on the ballot. And it looks like to me that gave the Democrats a big advantage in energy in the suburban areas where the bases are pretty closely matched.
Yeah, I noted that, Dave Wasserman, who covers the House for the Cook Report, who's a respected analyst, he had a pretty simple explanation, which made sense to me, which is that the down ballot Republicans in a lot of these House districts benefited both from the president turning out low propensity Republican voters who don't vote much, and having the never Trump Republicans still vote for them down ballot. Basically, in 2018, a lot of the never Trump Republicans who couldn't vote against Trump took it out on congressional candidates at the top of the ticket. This time, they were able to just vote against Donald Trump himself and maintain their party discipline down ballot. So they sort of got the twofer there, where they got the non-regular Trump voter who showed up to vote for the president and also voted for them, as well as their more typical Republicans who may be upset with the president but didn't hold it against him in this election.
I think a perfect example of that is in Philadelphia, or the Philadelphia suburbs, where you have a moderate Republican Congress member, Fitzgerald, who's sometimes publicly been critical of the president. And he survived in 2018, and he won easily this week because it looks like, again, his district went strongly against Trump. So a lot of voters in his district clearly voted for Biden and then came back and voted for him.
Mm-hmm. And so it's probably a lot of those college educated suburban professionals, right, who don't like paying taxes but are not happy with the performance of the president, right? So yeah. Okay, well, we've covered some of the national ground. Let's talk about Georgia just for a second, because looks like Biden may eke out a narrow victory there. It's probably not one that he needs based on his getting Pennsylvania, which looks likely, and probably Nevada for sure, and a good chance at Arizona as well, but pretty highly important symbolic victory to come back and potentially win a state like that. But perhaps more importantly, it looks like we're going to have 2 Senate runoffs there scheduled for January 5th. What do you make of that runoff situation?
Well, it'll be fascinating. There's some history of these, and generally they've not been good for Democrats. That when the Democrats have been forced into these runoffs, even if they say had a narrow lead in the election day vote, they typically lost by several more percent in the special runoffs that Georgia requires when nobody gets 50% in the state elections. That rule does not apply in the presidential race, of course. So history would say the Republicans would have a significant advantage, but there's a lot of momentum there. And I think if the Democrats are passing out medals, they sure ought to give one to Stacey Abrams, because she has worked tirelessly since her defeat for governor, which was very close, 0.5% or so. She says she's registered 800,000 people in Georgia. That's a hell of a lot. Georgia's, like Texas, been historically a low registration, low turnout state, and Republicans have been winning it easily. Well, they didn't win easily this week. They may still eke out a win, but it's basically at best a tie for them. So there's a better shot, particularly because the Democrats have kind of probably a pretty good statewide ticket in a special election with nothing else on the ballot. The African-American minister of the Ebenezer Baptist Church, 51-year-old Black candidate. And you've got a younger white person who I think is Jewish, who ran before for a Congress seat. They'll both raise $1 gazillion nationally because the Senate's at stake. So I think that with an African-American on the ticket, again, that you've got a real shot at mobilizing this substantial Black turnout that has grown enormously in Atlanta. And Ossoff is a pretty good candidate. He's from the suburbs of putting together the other part of the Democratic coalition that's getting some enthusiasm among white suburban voters that aren't very fond of Republicans. But I think one thing to watch to me is the behavior of the president in the next 8 weeks. He could blow their whole deal up if he just goes totally off the rails, and it's clear this guy is just has no interest in the country and so forth. And I think that's a real possibility. So I think Mitch McConnell is probably going to be running over to the White House pretty soon and say, you got to tone it down, man. This thing, we've got the Senate still at stake. We've got 8 weeks here before, or 8.5 weeks before we get back to another vote. And you're probably going to win or lose both of those seats. I can't imagine you're going to have a hell of a lot of people coming in and voting for 1D and 1R.
Well, but the extent, what I wonder about, just kind of based on the president's previous history, is that whether that kind of entreaty from McConnell, whether he'll care.
Yeah.
If you kind of sort of take Donald Trump at his face value, how he's behaved through most of this, is that if he's no longer in the picture in terms of national politics, why does he care what happens to the Republican Party in control of the Senate? He may not lift a finger to help, and he may decide to be destructive. I mean, he's shown some fairly nihilistic tendencies, frankly, down the stretch here and over the last several days. We'll see, but I think I've too thought that that's a very interesting question for a potentially close runoff. The disposition of the president towards it, and his willingness or lack thereof to be helpful or hurtful in that process, might make a difference if you're trying to turn some of his fervent supporters out, for example, who don't much care about the party. But if he says, go vote for these guys, they'll do it. I don't know what he'll do, but he seems to be largely consumed with his own situation at the moment.
He did visit Florida several times. Biden went once, but that's an open question. Does he go to Florida, to Georgia rather? Does he go to Georgia and campaign? In some sense, he's never been that interested in governing in Washington, and he does like to get out on the road. So one of the numerous unknowns is, does the president directly involve himself in this rather unprecedented runoff situation with 2 seats up and control of the Senate at stake? Or does he go back to the bunker and tweet?
Right. Well, it'll be interesting to see. And just to wrap up the national, I mean, some indication that Biden and Harris may address the country this evening, and at least my guess is sort of tentatively declare some sense of we won. I don't know for sure that that's going to happen. That appears to be what media reports are saying. I mean, how do we expect that this quote unquote transition is likely to play out? I mean, there have been reports that Trump said to confidants he has no intention of conceding. That in and of itself is not required by law or anything else. It's just a sort of norm of what's been done in the past, but there's nothing written in stone that says it has to be done. How do you think, assuming we believe he's lost the election, what do you think he does over the next several weeks?
It's a great question. I would hope that for the good of the country, he would do what the normal behavior is, and that's whether you concede formally or not, but you instruct all the people in your administration that are running important aspects of government to work with the incoming administration. Biden has already been working a good bit, but keeping it quiet because he's rather superstitious about, Tom Dewey putting his cabinet on the front page of Life magazine the week before the election. Not a good idea. But Biden, being a longtime experienced hand, has done a lot of prep work, low key. But if you got an administration that isn't interacting in important agencies like the State Department, the Defense Department, we got the kind of ultimate possibility that Trump starts exacting vengeance on people that are key in his administration because he didn't think they supported him enough. He talked about getting rid of the head of the FBI and Dr. Fauci and so forth. So this will be a transition like none ever seen before. And I really worry not to the benefit of the country, because Trump doesn't, as Cindy McCain said, or Trump doesn't care about the country. And I'm afraid that's what we're going to see in the next 74 days.
Yeah, would be interesting to watch. Let's shift gears to closer to home, to the state of Texas. Most polling and showed the Texas basically within the margin of error leading into the election. Lots of the large sort of rating entities moved the state of Texas to a toss-up category prior to the election, including the Cook Political Report and 538 and NBC News and others. In my own conversations with my Republican counterparts in the state, there was a general sense that the state was extremely close. It turned out to be closer than 2016, but not as close as had been previously thought. As of now, it looks like the president is carrying Texas by about 5.8 percentage points, We had a huge increase in turnout from 2016, from 8.9 million to a record around 11.3, I believe, 11.2, 11.3, somewhere in that range, but a massive increase in participation. Many perhaps thought that would redound to the Democrats' benefit. Margin will show, I think, Democrats overall gained votes relative to their vote share in 2016, but Republicans maintained their statewide advantage as well as in most of these competitive districts. What's your read of how Texas played out?
Yeah, I think obviously disappointing for the Democrats and encouraging for the Republicans that they've still got a pretty solid grip on the state. Biden got about 1.3 million more votes than Clinton, and Trump got about 1 million more votes than Trump. So, the vote went up, but Trump didn't lag that much. He improved his performance pretty clearly among Hispanics. And it seems to be half of the Democrats falling short was Latinos. And the other half was super turnout among white older voters across the state. And there was an increase in voting. The gentrifying inner suburban areas were very strongly for Biden this time. But the exurbs were hugely for Trump. And again, real underperformance all along the border with Democrats. And black turnout was okay and pretty solid, but some erosion there with black men, particularly it looks like under 40. So, it added up to losing by less than 6 points as opposed to 9 points last time, but that's still a significant loss with a very high turnout. So work to be done. The Democratic Party of Texas really needs to, and the National Party, think about how do you fix this Hispanic problem that we saw in Florida and Texas, where you had a dramatic drop in support from Clinton to Biden.
Yeah, but you didn't see in Arizona, for example, where I think most showed that Biden won 75% of the Latino vote in Arizona, and I think it'll be probably in the low 60s in Texas overall, or low to mid 60s. So right, and I agree, and again, I think one of the things that we talked about earlier nationally was the case here with regard to the competitive congressional and legislative races around the state, which were largely concentrated in the suburban areas of Texas. And you saw basically that increase, that Trump turnout increase of infrequent voters, perhaps flipping some nominally Democratic voters over to his side. And then those never Trump Republicans and independents we talked about who may have voted against the president at the top of the ticket, reverting back to their normal behavior down ballot. And so in lots of these congressional and legislative races, even though Democrats were able to substantially increase their vote for all their candidates in these districts, they were exceeded by Republican performance. And essentially the status quo held in Texas. There was no change in the congressional delegations makeup. Democrats won one state house seat, lost another, so net zero there, and then regained a Texas Senate seat in the San Antonio area that they had lost in a special election, but that was a Democratic seat to begin with. So basically the status quo was maintained. Is it your sense that it's just that same phenomenon that was going on nationwide that played out here?
Yeah, with the one district that the Democrats really we think should have won, the 23rd, which is huge, but has an urban suburban section in the San Antonio area. That most analysts thought the only Republican who could win that was Will Hurd, who was a more moderate Republican, a former CIA officer or whatever, and he retired. So it looked like a great pickup opportunity. The woman who had run against him 2 years ago and lost by 0.5% or so was running again, but very pretty far on the left, progressive. And Texas Hispanics aren't there, I think. This is not the Bronx and Brooklyn where AOC can win with a very far left defund the police rhetoric. Here, even in one of our most Hispanic districts, you probably need a more moderate Hispanic to run. That's kind of the Henry Cuellar message coming out of Laredo. Where he held off a very progressive Democrat in the primary and won easily in his own district. So maybe, you got to look pretty carefully at matching your nominees to their own district electorate across the state. I think culturally, Hispanic voters mostly Mexican American, are pretty conservative on a range of issues. And again, you don't want to bring AOC into Texas to campaign for somebody in the general election.
Yeah, and I had a thought about the kind of underperformance, especially in along the border among Democrats in this election, and to some extent in some previous elections too. And that's like, we've talked a lot in Texas politics and national politics about this sort of urban and suburban divide versus the rural divide. And my suspicion is that those rural Latino voters behave a lot more like rural white voters as opposed to big metro Latino and Hispanic voters that probably vote a lot more like their white and African American neighbors in those areas. There's just a difference in cultural values and conservatism that you described. It's a difference in focus on issues. A lot of those parts of rural Texas, Hispanic and otherwise, are really struggling economically. They the cultural issues that the Democratic Party has put front and center in many cases are just not salient for a lot of those communities and are frankly alienating to some of those voters in other ways. I mean, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. It is what it is. And but I think, as you said, that's sort of part of some of the fact finding that in the state and around the country that the Democrats are going to have to do, I think, if they want to try to improve their performance with some of these voters, which many would argue they would need to do to be successful overall in Texas.
And those areas are struggling economically, and a lot of the jobs that do exist there across the whole swath of from El Paso all the way to the lower Rio Grande are tied to the energy industry. And I think Biden's, perhaps for Texas at least, unfortunate remark in the second debate about, yeah, he was going to phase out the fossil fuels. I've watched his counties that used to be very, very Democratic, like Duval, very, heavily Latino in South Texas, but also a heavily oil and gas producing area. And if your job is a good paying one and everybody else is struggling, and you have a candidate you don't think is friendly to your industry, it's going to be hard for you to vote Democratic. So you have the same phenomenon in Western Pennsylvania. Biden lost almost all those counties. He did fine in metropolitan Pittsburgh, which is a prosperous area with a very strong tech sector, lots of medicine, well-educated. But outside, he lost virtually every county in that natural gas producing part of the state. It just, he was rolling up such big margins over in Philadelphia and the suburbs and doing better in his own eastern base. He carried a whole bunch of the counties now we see after the around Scranton that Clinton lost, but he only carried them because the vote he added in the absentee. But most parts of the country, I don't think that phase out the fossil fuels hurt Biden at all, because that's appealing to a lot of younger voters across the country. But I think it hurt in Texas. I think it probably hurt him in Western Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and as I mentioned before, I think COVID is tied in with that, right? Because the sort of lockdowns, quasi lockdowns that happened that are due to COVID, slowed gas usage, people not driving as much, et cetera, which led to a slowdown in the industry that was already having some problems. And again, it's so the Democrats are associated with closing things down to protect public health, which I think, people understand that, but if it conflicts with your bread and butter ability to potentially make a living, I think there were some voters that just reject that. And so I think the whole Green New Deal stuff plus the COVID thing was a double whammy with those energy folks here in the Houston area in some cases, and as you say, out in West Texas and down in some parts of South Texas as well. That's my guess. And obviously, Democrats had targeted a number of congressional seats for pickups. They did not win any of those. The two freshman Democratic members both hung on, but probably by weaker than expected margins. Colin Allred in Dallas County and Lizzie Fletcher here in Harris County. Do you think that was a sense of just enormous turnout due to Trump? Were those districts reverting back to the norm after 2018, some combination of those things? I mean, what do you, obviously these districts are likely to change before these members run again, but what do you think that, how that bodes for the future for these incumbent members of Congress, both on the DNR side and then people who want to potentially win new seats?
Well, unlike several of their colleagues that came in the 2018, Allred and Fletcher survived, and not by razor thin margins. Fletcher got slightly less percentage than she got 2 years ago, but with vastly higher turnout. So, they had very well funded campaigns, and I think in both cases they were very good candidates, but they had very good Republican opponents as well. It seems to me that the underlying demographics had shifted a bit more favorably to the Democrats, and that helped them withstand this loss, because I think some of the Republican defectors in 2018, as we've said earlier, came back, and after perhaps not voting for Trump, because Trump, I think, lost both of these districts again, but voted for the local Republican. So, they survived. It's probably, their districts are probably going to be changed. They're probably amenable to removing some parts of their district. And for Congress, we're going to pick up 2 or 3 additional seats, with Republicans controlling the process now after continuing to have the legislative majorities in the governorship. They will probably be looking to draw a map that can sustain most of their 23 incumbents, which, if they're wise, would do something along the lines of using at least a couple of those districts in Metro, Dallas, or Austin, Houston, to give them to the Democrats, but get some of those Democratic areas that are endangering Republicans out of those districts, because these margins were still pretty close in what in Texas was a great year for Republicans. And, you can have another bad year in a 10-year cycle and get wiped out. That's a decision for next year. We'll get the census numbers in a few weeks, we think. But with our legislature meeting in January, that's one of the first orders of business. You're going to have to take up redrawing our maps in an already extremely challenging session because of the financial stress the state's facing and the public health crisis, which sadly, since we spoke last week, looks like it is rapidly getting much, much worse.
Yeah. And of course, the Texas House had been also discussed quite a bit, targeting potentially 15 to 20 seats for flipping. The Republicans targeting as many of the dozen seats that Democrats had won in 2018 to flip back. As I said earlier, largely a wash there. One seat changed hands in each direction, but no net gain for either party. I wonder now, with redistricting coming up, we've talked about the fact that the changes in population growth and where those have occurred in the state versus where they have not, big metros growing, rural Texas not growing, is going to in and of itself cause some fundamental changes to how seats are drawn for the state house and to a lesser extent the state Senate. But I wonder, for example, about something like Dallas County, where the Republicans have been reduced to 2 members, and there was a real chance that both of them would lose this year. As of now, it looks like both retained their seats, although one race is pretty close. There's just a couple of hundred votes separating the 2 candidates, with still some mail ballots being tabulated. But assuming that they hang on to both of those seats, I wonder if from a, map drawing, and then it just makes it easier for them to try to shore up those existing 2 Republican House members in Dallas and leave the rest to the Democrats in the county. I mean, does Dallas County get more seats? Does Harris County get another seat back? When some rural seats go away, where do they get replaced? Or, what parts of the state do they get replaced? And what does that do to map drawing on the legislative level?
Well, I think you subtract in the state house 1 Democratic seat somewhere from El Paso to the lower Rio Grande. And in the rest of the state, you subtract 4 Republican seats in East Texas, North Texas, and West Texas that are outside the metro areas. All of those seats, 4 or 5, are the ones that have to be transferred to the metropolitan areas where 84% of the growth has occurred. The bottom line is, if you don't grow at the state's average in the legislative redistricting, your district has to get bigger, because, with Congress, you got 2 or 3 extra districts and you have a lot more flexibility. But that's not the case, because we're not increasing the size of the state Senate or the size of the state House. And with the state House, with these metros, you can't cross county lines. if you got enough population to warrant an even number of districts within your unit. So I think this is going to be a much more challenging redistricting for the Republican map drawers than was the case in 2011. The growth is in the areas that are most politically dynamic and are significantly less Republican than they were 10 years ago. And you learn something from that map. It worked wonderfully at first. You went over 100 seats. Here at the end of the map, you're down to winning 83. So you lost 18 seats over the life of the map. And the same thing can keep happening. Rural Texas is not going to grow. And these urban transitional areas, I think, are going to continue to be challenging for Republicans. And so I think I'll be involved again in the redistricting at the state level at some level, and it'll be fascinating. But if I were a Republican map drawer, I would know the challenge is much more difficult than it was in 2011. You can't count on these upscale suburban voters to be necessarily very Republican, as Sarah Davis found out here, that her district had become vehemently anti-Trump. And it finally got to be so extreme that she couldn't survive because the president probably lost this district like 70-30 this time around.
I think he got 38%, and she still managed to get almost 48%. So substantially overperforming him, but it was just too big a hill to climb this time. And incidentally, that was the only Republican held House district, at least so far, the Democrats won. And then they lost one out in Western Harris County in the Katy area, Cypress area.
Yeah, I think you'll see a lot of in the urban areas where you can't cross the county lines, like Harris, adjacent members, particularly if they're of different parties, doing some swap negotiating. I expect that Representative Murphy, who has the adjoining district to Sarah Davis's, the west side of his district, I think he wants to get rid of. So I wouldn't be surprised if he talks to the new Democratic member, Ann Johnson, and said, I got about 5 or 6 precincts. I'd really like to give you one way or the other. And I'd like to get River Oaks and a few other boxes because they're kind of stuck over in this Democratic district and they'd be better off with my Memorial area Republicans. So I think what you'll see is some of these swaps that members set. My own number one priority is their self-interest. And I think a Murphy-Johnson swap makes eminently good sense because Murphy lost his district 12 years ago.
Right.
He knows a district can keep changing on you. And I think he wants to get rid of all those people out on Westheimer that have become suddenly more Democratic and get some of those affluent folks that are in the district that was drawn to protect Sarah Davis, but ultimately failed. So there'll be a lot of twists and turns, but the redistricting will be more complicated, even though Republicans control it top to bottom. And we know the federal courts are not going to meaningfully intervene.
Great. Well, I think that's a good place to sort of wrap our remarks. And I've got a couple of questions in the chat that I want to get to. One was about the COVID crisis effect on the election, but we already pretty much discussed that, I think. Next one was, what was the Texas legislature's motivation in eliminating straight ticket voting? I have thoughts about that, but you want to, and I think based on the results, I think they were wise to do it this election.
That was done in the session in 2017 after the Republicans were wiped out totally again in Harris County and Dallas County, and particularly in the judicial races. So I think they thought, well, if we could separate, particularly in presidential years where Democrats were getting a lot of votes in the metropolitan areas, Obama back in 08 and 12, and then Clinton in 2016, let's eliminate straight ticket vote, but not too quickly. So they kept it in place for 2018, figuring we've done well in midterm elections. That turned out to be a big mistake because it was a terrible election for Republicans in metropolitan areas, but it did come into effect in 2020. Harris County, like Dallas County and Travis County, has become so Democratic, didn't make any difference. When you're still, Trump lost the county by 210,000 votes, and that sank all the Republicans. But it did save a couple of appellates, I think, that won out in the 1st and 14th district, 2 or 3. But it was just a calculation by the Republicans who were controlling the process that straight ticket voting, which used to be fine when all the straight tickets were sweeping in Republicans, but not fine anymore. So you ditch it. It looks to me like most people still voted a straight ticket in the down ballot races. There wasn't a huge roll off People didn't just vote for Trump or Biden and stop voting. Most people still went down and voted on down the ballot, and you're largely consistently D or R.
Yeah, I thought that was remarkable too. I think, based on things like past primaries where you'd see roll off of 20, 25, even 30% down ballot in a lot of these races, it was more like 5. And with the huge turnout and number of infrequent voters who were showing up, and in cases like ours, a long ballot, I was struck by how few people didn't vote down ballot. There was very little drop off from top to bottom. I mean, single digits, which is not much in my experience.
Most people now, even if they say I'm an independent, when it comes to their actual voting behavior, they're highly partisan.
Yeah.
Most independents now actually lean to one party or the other, and they vote pretty much like the self-confessed partisans.
What about just one more local race, but we didn't talk about? What about the race for Precinct 3 out in Western Harris County? That was the Republican commissioner elected to retire there. There was a lot of speculation based on the previous numbers in that district that it was pretty competitive. It was reasonably close, but the Republican candidate won by 4 points or something like that. Do you think that was just an effect of the sort of turnout surge we'd already discussed?
Yeah, the Democrats did win the county pretty handily, but the 2 Republican commissioner districts, stayed Republican, and there's a decent Republican vote over in Precinct 2, Adrian Garcia. Of course, Democrats won control of the court in 2018 and will have control when we redistrict the county, and that thus will be done by Democrats. So what probably happens over there before the next election is that the Democrats push the most Republican parts of precincts 3 and 4 into one district. It's probably a very safe Republican district for the next 10 years, but it opens up one of those districts to another significant challenge from the Democrats, depending on how you allocate. 3 obviously was up this time. It's not up until 2024, but 4, of course, then must be up in 2022. So long term, you probably can't sustain 2 Republican county commissioner districts in our county. It's getting too Democratic. So you're probably going to see, despite the result of this election, that Republicans still have 2, you'll probably see the Commissioners Court setting up a 3-to-1 map when they redraw the districts in 2021 next year.
So question on that would be, I think most people had thought that if the Democratic candidate had won Precinct 3 this year, that then that would be the precinct they would make more Democratic and make 4 more Republican. Given that 4 is up in 2022, do you think now the reverse is likely to occur and that they're likely to make 3 as Republican as possible and then make 4 more winnable in 2022?
Pretty good chance of that. It's a very small group of 3 that can meet in a phone booth and decide what their strategy is. Their number one priority, it seems to me, would be to make sure that the Latino member in the East, Adrian Garcia, has a safer district. And there are a lot of ways to do that. But the next would be to look at this combining parts of 3 and 4 into one much more Republican district. And 4 was just about the same partisan split as 3. So it's kind of a toss up as to which way you go if you decide to do this, go for a 3-1 map, protecting Garcia first, but still looking to create one more district that Democrats can win. But great question. And, I know the commissioner, a couple of them slightly, and I certainly have had no conversations with them, but, I think that's the way they'll be probably looking at this. But yeah, it puts Cagle maybe put in a bad place. I don't know where he lives, but, you can move the deals around, and he might find himself in a district that's already getting a little more purple, that it would be tough to win.
Yeah, interesting. Someone asked a question about late arriving ballots in Pennsylvania being segregated. I think this was happening in Allegheny County in the Pittsburgh area about because the Secretary of State because of a court case. What effect does that have? My understanding is it just delayed until later this afternoon, any counting of those ballots, about 35,000 of them, if I recall.
Yeah, there'll be a few of these ballots probably drifting in, but the Democrats, I think, did a pretty good job, knowing they had a huge number of mail ballots out that had been requested, of informing people, you got to get these back in. And so Allegheny is important because it has a huge number of regular mail ballots, and it's going to increase the margin for Biden and thus contribute to what is almost certainly, I'd say 99.8%, that Biden wins Pennsylvania, because Allegheny is a very Democratic county, and the mail ballots are even more Democratic. So that 35,000 votes there, that's probably 27,000 for Biden and 8,000 for Trump. And that puts you way up above the 50-50 line. So I think Pennsylvania's a done deal. You can try to string it out by slowing down the count. But once you get behind, and every report shows you're getting farther behind, there's no rabbits you can pull out of a hat. I mean, most election officials are pretty darn honest. The idea of stealing tens of thousands of votes, sure, Chicago 1952, maybe, not Pittsburgh 2020.
Sure. So, and all with this, after this question, we'll wrap up. But so, given Democrats' failures to win increased congressional seats, losing some seats, is Nancy Pelosi's speakership in jeopardy?
I don't know. There's certainly some unhappiness with her in both directions. A lot of the moderates, most I think, felt she did what she could to protect them, but some on the left are certainly agitating for change the leadership. Most of the Democratic House leadership is quite elderly. Nancy's 80, and a couple of the other key people are right around 80 years of age now. I don't think
Schumer's about that age too, right? Pretty close to it. Yeah.
So I think you got to leave Jim Clyburn in place. I think the president might put a word in. Don't think about touching that guy from South Carolina. He sort of helped me out a little bit back in March. Apparently the group call was pretty raucous the other day. But Nancy's one of the most skilled political operators, a little bit in a different way that, like Mitch McConnell. They're not beloved, but they tend to get stuff done within their own conference or caucus.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think with that, we're going to call it a day. Been quite a week. I'm not sure how often we'll continue to do these. We'll sort of take it on a week by week basis, and maybe we'll do one next week. I'm sure there are going to be lots of things that happen between now and then, but the election itself is in the books, or mostly anyway, and it's been quite a cycle, to say the least.
I want to make one point before we leave.
Sure.
We're going to see absolutely record-breaking vote when we add it all up, and that takes 30 more days. But Biden's on track clearly to exceed 80 million votes. Trump to get probably around 73 million. That's a 10, 11 million up for Trump and 15 million more for Biden. So whatever else, I think we can credit the 45th president of the United States with being one of the greatest turnout machines in American political history, for him and against him.
Yeah. And, and even in a low voting state like Texas, we got 2/3 of our registered voters to turn out and vote in this election. That's pretty impressive.
In some counties and precincts.
Yeah.
Mostly Republican areas.
Yeah.
So clearly Trump was a positive statewide, without question. Look at the increases, enormous in the most red areas, increases in the blue areas, but not at the same level as the Republican precincts and counties.
All right. Well, with that, I think we're going to wrap it up. And thanks everybody for joining us, and enjoy your weekend. And we will reconvene at some point, perhaps next Friday, if not pretty soon after that. Okay. Bye-bye.